Hello, dear students. This is the lecture on some bioethical issues on transplantation, organ and tissue transplantation in the context of the course in healthcare bioethics in the program of the Master of Science in Bioethics at St. Thomas University. Beginning as always with a little prayer in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. O Lord, send forth your Spirit, and we shall be recreated, and you shall renew the face of the earth. Amen. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Okay, this lecture will cover, as I mentioned, some bioethical issues with regards to organ and tissue transplantation. And the first thing we need to say about that is that thanks to advancement in biomedical procedures today, transplantation is quite successful, whether the organs are cadaveric or living. In other words, cadaveric meaning that they come from a deceased person, from a cadaver, who has previously consented, of course, to donate their organs or tissues. Or if there is no direct consent from the deceased person, the proxy or the next of kin may consent on their behalf. And then again, thanks to the advancement of medical technology today, the transplantation can also be done with living organs. In other words, the donor can donate certain organs and tissues and continue living. Okay, so we'll look at that mostly in the second half of the lecture. Let's go forward then. With regards to transplantation, I also want to mention that for a long time, or at the beginning of organ transplantations last century, the transplants were not that successful. They would not last too long on the patient, on the recipient, mostly due to the immune rejection. First, we didn't have the advanced surgical procedures that we have today. And secondly, the patient's immune system typically attacked the organ or the tissue that was transplanted into her or him and would kill the organ or the tissue, so that they were not very successful, the transplants that were done last century. But then little by little, medicine continued to advance, and now it's quite successful. The rate of success is quite high for transplants of organs and tissues. So this is one area of medicine that has advanced quite a bit in the past 100 years or so, okay? And originally, the question, the bioethical question, at least from the Catholic perspective, was, could we justify transplantation at all of organs and tissues? Because especially of living transplants, since that became available again in, I guess, in the middle of the 1900s, more or less, when it was already feasible to transplant typically kidneys from a living donor, because it was already known that a human being can live with one kidney and have a perfectly normal and functional life. So if the recipient, if the patient who's on renal failure, for example, can receive one kidney, then the donor can also live with one kidney and continue living, all right? And donate one kidney and continue living. But the question was, could we justify mutilation of a vital organ from a healthy person, right? So the mutilation of a vital organ from a healthy person. And that's because at that time, up until that time, transplantation was being seen more structurally than functionally. It's an interesting concept. In other words, the kidneys are a vital organ and they're vital structures, right? So from that perspective, it was not justifiable ethically to remove a healthy kidney from a patient. But then when we switch, or the bioethical discussion switch to looking at vital organs functionally rather than structurally, then it was realized that functionally, like I say, one kidney can be sufficient for a person to live with that one kidney, essentially a normal life. And so it was that shift into looking at the functionality of the organs that allowed Catholic bioethicists to make the judgment that yes, a donor may donate one kidney. Essentially, it was looking specifically at kidneys, like I mentioned, and keep on living. So it was no longer seen that way as removing a vital organ from a healthy person. A similar argument can be made for the lungs. We have 2 lungs, but we actually have 5 lobes, 3 lobes on one side and 2 lobes on the other side. And a person who's receiving a lung transplant typically can live with 2 or 3 lobes. They're not going to run the marathon, of course. They're going to live a very sedentary life, but they can continue living, all right? And that means that a donor can donate one of the lungs, one of the lobes of the lung, and continue living with 4 lobes, pretty much a healthy lifestyle. And so, for example, in lung transplantation, maybe 2 lobes from 2 different living patients could help a person who needs new lungs to have that transplant. And this would be living donations. It's kind of rare, all right, but it can be done, at least physiologically. The donors can continue living with 4 lobes instead of the original 5, each one. Okay, so the question had arisen there whether we can justify bioethically transplantation, okay? And the final conclusion, once we shift into functional instead of structural, then yes. To the point that already for several decades, the church has been promoting and encouraging people to be transplant donors. Okay, whether it's cadaveric, in other words, when we die, to donate our organs instead of taking them to the grave, to donate our organs to others who may benefit from that, or living with the organs that we have available for donating in lifetime. Moving forward, we need to look at some terminology here a little bit. Basically, 3 main words, autograft, allograft, and xenotransplantation, so that we have a basic understanding of the language. Autograft or autologous transplant is from the same person, okay? And we can think of some examples. One would be stem cells from one part of the body to another part. One aspect that can be done is, now there are several sources of stem cells in our bodies. These are technically known as adult stem cells, right? Even if the person is technically underage, they're still considered adult stem cells, in contrast to the embryonic stem cells that we talked about in another course. But essentially, an autologous transplant of stem cells have also been found in the bloodstream. So stem cells can be procured out of the bloodstream in a procedure that is kind of similar to pheresis, when we donate platelets, right? That the patient is hooked up to a machine that circulates the blood out of the body, kind of what happens with a dialysis machine. And then that blood is put through filters and the platelets are oozed out of the blood, literally, into a bag, a sterile bag. And that takes several hours, typically 2-3 hours, more or less. So a similar procedure can be done for obtaining stem cells, okay, in the bloodstream. There are few, there are not that many, but they're there, and they can be used to be transplanted into another part of the body. For example, one that is being done today is into the knees if the person is suffering some kind of arthritis, and those stem cells have helped patients with arthritis, particularly of the knees, from their own body. These are still experimental treatments, but a lot of research is going into that area. So the bottom line is that we can transplant stem cells from one part of our body into another part, and that would be an autologous transplant or an autograft. Also, skin, for example, in the case of burns, burn on some part of the body, then tissue skin can be taken from another part of the body to help heal the burned tissue, the burned skin on another part of the body. Okay, so those are all autologous transplants. And the obvious benefit of that is that there is no immune rejection because it's all tissue from the same patient, and therefore there is immunocompatibility of every organ and tissue of our body. Okay, now the most common transplants are actually allografts. Allografts, in other words, that the organ or tissue comes from another person who is not the patient. And therefore, the first problem with these type of transplants is the immune rejection that occurs on the patient with regards to the donated or the transplanted organ or tissue, simply because even though it's the same species, right? They're all human beings, but we all have particulars about our DNA. It's kind of like a genetic fingerprint that even tissue or organs from another person, from another human being in our body, the body looks at them as a foreign object and attacks them in an immune response. Okay, so the problem with allografts is that the immune system has to be toned down, has to be suppressed, and we'll talk about that briefly. Basically, to know that these allografts can come either from a cadaver, someone who has already died and has donated the organs beforehand, typically on the driver's license it's noted, or if they haven't, like I mentioned, the next of kin or the proxy of the deceased person can also consent to donate those organs, all right? Or they can come from living. We'll talk about living donors. This is a very exciting field in transplantation today because a number of organs can be donated by living donors. And the big advantage of living organ donation is that they last longer. They're healthier because the moment that a person dies, then the body starts going into catabolism, right? Breakdown of molecules and tissues and so forth. And so the organs, individual organs and tissues begin to die with the death process. And so those organs or tissues that are transplanted are not as healthy, all right? They've begun necrosis, and therefore they typically, on average, don't last as long on the patient, on the recipient, as living organs, because living organs or tissues are transplanted while they're still fresh, okay? And so the transplant time is minimized literally down to minutes whenever possible. All right, so the third type of transplantation that could occur is xenotransplantation. And xenotransplantation is a reference to receiving organs or tissues from another animal, typically, the one that is most common, as far as I know, is the heart valves from a pig. It turns out that the pig heart, more or less, is very similar to the human heart, even in size. And so pig heart valves have been transplanted into human patients with some kind of deficiency or deformity of the heart valves for many years now. And so this is a type of transplantation that is known as a xenotransplantation from another species. There's also some experimentation going on right now on growing human organs in other animals to see how well those organs do to keep them fresh, or tissues, and prepare them for transplantation into humans. But that's still very, very experimental right now. Okay, moving forward then. Just a brief review of what constitutes vital organs, and then what organs can be transplanted while living for the donor. So we have vital organs: the heart, the kidney, the liver, the lung, the pancreas, the intestines, the thymus gland also. And the most common of these are the kidney, the liver, and the heart for transplantation. Okay, this is overall whether the donor is living or deceased. These are the organs, the typical organs that can be transplanted, vital organs that can be transplanted. As far as living donors is concerned, the three organs that can be transplanted normally by living donors is the kidney, the liver, and the lung. Again, in that sequence by most common. So the kidneys is the easiest one in principle, because normally we have two kidneys that are healthy. And like I mentioned, someone can live with one kidney, a normal productive life. And so we can, in principle, as long as we're healthy, we can all donate one kidney and just keep on living. The liver, it would be not the whole liver, obviously, but just a lobe. We have 3 lobes of the liver, and typically one can donate 1 lobe. And that lobe generally regenerates because the liver has a lot of regeneration capacity, has stem cells, right? And so the liver lobes normally on a healthy individual regenerate. So a living donor can donate 1 lobe to a patient who is maybe on liver failure and can keep on living, all right? The lungs I mentioned earlier, it's more rare. I'm going to show you a case though where, no, that's separate, I'm sorry. So I mentioned that a person could live with 2 lobes, a sedentary life, not very active such, okay, because they're gonna be short of breath, but they can live a quiet life with 2 lungs, typically would be like emphysema, for example. And so 2 donors can donate 1 lobe each, and the 2 donors can continue living with 4 lobes, a normal healthy life. So these are living organ transplants. I'm also going to show you the example of the rare case where one can also donate a living heart and keep on living. But it involves what is known as domino transplants, okay? And we'll get to domino transplants a little further down the lecture. I want to shift gears a little bit into tissues, just to mention that tissues can also be donated and transplanted. So it's quite a few tissues that can be transplanted. Bone grafts, you hear about bone grafts every now and then, and also bone marrow, which bone marrow, you know, makes the blood cells, makes red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and so forth. So bone marrow can be donated, and typically for leukemia patients, for example, right? Tendons can be donated also. Tendons can be transplanted. Remember, tendons hold the tension produced by muscles. So skeletal muscles are attached to bone by tendons. Ligaments are different. Ligaments attach bone to bone, all right? So they ligate, or they hold together the skeleton, the ligaments do. But tendons are fibers that connect muscle, skeletal muscle, to bone, to the skeleton. And the skeletal muscles are the ones that we have that we can move voluntarily. So the skeletal muscles are innervated, they are wired up by the central nervous system over which we have conscious control. In other words, we can voluntarily move our skeleton by contracting our skeletal muscles. And those are the ones that are attached by tendons to bone. The cornea of the eye can be transplanted also. This typically is cadaveric transplantation. You may have heard of the Lions Eye Bank. The Lions Club is a benevolent association, a social association that is here in the United States and throughout the world. There's an international Lions Club. Okay, and they're very active. They have taken kind of this ministry or this charge, if you will, to host and manage and manicure practically the largest eye bank in the world. And it's not the whole eye, not the whole eye or eyeball. What they manage and supply is the cornea of the eye. Okay, so that people who have some kind of cornea defect and therefore would be blind can see again through this transplant of cornea. Skin can be transplanted, I mentioned, typically for burns or other injuries of the skin, extensive damage, maybe from a scrape, a serious accident or something like that. The heart valves can also be transplanted. Nerves, some nerves can be transplanted. Veins, for example, in the case of varicose, veins are taken from legs, other extremities, and transplanted into other parts of the body. And of course, the stem cells that can be transplanted from one part of the body to another. The most common are the cornea and tissues associated with the skeletal system and the muscle system. But also bone marrow is quite common now. All right, and now the advantage of tissue transplant is that many tissues can be frozen and banked, right? While a match is found for the recipient, for the patient. But organs typically are not frozen. They have to be fresh. They have to be fresh, even if they're harvested from a cadaver. Those organs need to move fast, and the general window for organ transplantation is within 24 hours. That's the window in general. They are usually kept in ice, not dry ice, because the dry ice would actually burn the tissue, okay? But just regular ice in ice chests, and that's how they're transported, sometimes even interstate by flight, by plane from one place to another when a match has been found. Okay, so let's move forward now. And let's look at the issue of immune rejection, because I was mentioning that receiving an organ from another individual or a tissue, then the body naturally will mount an immune response, the body of the patient. Okay, they'll mount an immune response because it's going to detect that organ or tissue as a foreign object, a foreign body, and will attack it, and it will end up killing it if it's allowed to do its function, if the immune system is allowed to do its function. And certainly we don't want that to happen in a transplant situation. And so the patient's immune system has to be toned down, not shut off totally 100%, because then that patient will be susceptible to any kind of infection. Right now, we're breathing bacteria, we're breathing viruses in and out, and we're breathing also spores of fungi and so forth. And so we have an immune system that takes care of all that for normal, healthy people. And so the immune system is toned down on transplant patients, but not totally shut off, right? And it's done with immunosuppressant drugs that are fine-tuned to the patient, to the specific patient. And so this medicine has also been optimized, and that's why I'm saying that today transplantation, the field of transplantation of organ and tissue transplantation has become very, very successful. All right, and it's ramped up in part because surgeries are done better, even robotic surgery, which are actually more precise and accurate than the traditional hand of a surgeon, done by a robot instead. I'll talk more about that in the second part of the lecture. But also the whole issue of immunosuppressant drugs has become more and more sophisticated. So overall, result of that is that organs and tissues that are transplanted into patients are lasting longer and longer and more successful transplantation. Even so, the issue is trying to find a match between the donor and the recipient, whether the donor is living or cadaveric, right? To try to find the match. And so there is a matching scale that is known also as serotyping. Serotyping is essentially looking at some factors in the blood, typically proteins and other factors that are measured to see the compatibility. One obvious compatibility would be, for example, the blood type. The blood type, whether it's A, B, or O, all right? And then the Rh factor also, whether it's Rh positive or negative for both donor and recipient, so that has to be matched up. That's kind of the first level of matching that is done. And then some more matching at a more sophisticated level with the serotyping, looking at some key factors in the blood. And so there is a score that is produced by the transplantation team that is called the panel reactive antibody level. Panel reactive antibody level, and that's also known as the PRA score. PRA, which is just the acronym for panel reactive antibody. Okay, these are yes, antibodies that we have in our immune system that attack foreign objects within our body. And so there's a cluster of them that is measured and see how reactive our antibodies are, and that's the PRA score. And that's part of the matching scale. People who have become, also to give an example here, at least for the kidney, which I'm more familiar with, for kidney transplantation, typically the score is like from 1 to 4, all right? From 1 to 4, 1 being the least compatible and 4 being the most compatible or the biggest, the greatest match. And it doesn't have to be a perfect score. Like I say, it doesn't have to be all the way to 4. It could be like from 2.5 or 3 forward. That is also already considered a match, a good match, okay? So it doesn't have to be a perfect score. It can be from 2.5 comes to about 60, 70% forward. That's considered a good match for doing the transplantation. All right, so the PRA score, when it becomes higher, then it means that the body has been sensitized to some kind of foreign tissue or organ. And so this is typically for patients who have received some transplant before, okay? They may have already received an organ or a tissue before, and so that raises their PRA score, and therefore they are more sensitized to a future transplant, okay? And these are patients that then would have more difficulty in getting a transplant because their PRA score has been sensitized. Anyway, this is with regards to the match that is sought out between the donor and the recipient. So it begs the question of how this matching is being done, because it's at the national level. And typically this is measured within each country, at least for the United States, which is the case that I'm more familiar with. There are 2 main agencies that take care of matching donors and recipient, again, whether the donor is living or cadaveric. There are 2 national agencies that are regulated by regulatory agencies and so forth, and we're going to look at those 2 agencies in a minute. Okay, before we get into the actual agencies that there are 2, one that does the procurement of the organs and the other one that does the allocation of the organs or tissues, all right? Now, before that, I want to talk a little bit about these domino transplants. In other words, this field of medicine of organ transplantation, organ and tissue transplantation, has gotten very creative and to try to find that match, the best match. All right. And like I said, there are national registries that look at donors and recipients throughout the whole United States. And these computerized systems are working all the time. It's a very dynamic, interactive system that is seeking to find a match anywhere in the United States, because of course, people are going into health issues all the time. You know, you can estimate with 330 million people more or less in the United States, there are people who are going on dialysis all the time, who are going on kidney failure, or become diabetic, or catch emphysema, et cetera, or leukemia, any of the illnesses or accidents that would then make the patient a potential beneficiary, a potential recipient of an organ transplant. And then on the other side of things, of organ procurement or organ donation, there are people who are dying all the time in the United States, right? And sometimes from tragic blows to the head, which basically leaves all of the organs and tissues from the neck down kind of intact, but there was a fatal blow to the head, typically accidents, motorcycle accidents. And so if that, those are potential donors, cadaveric donors of vital organs, or living donors, like I mentioned, if someone voluntarily wants to donate some organ or tissue of their body. So domino transplants is a very creative way that involves 2 or more patients, rather more than 2 patients, sometimes pairs of patients, to find a match, right? And I'll give you several examples. One example here with a heart and lung transplant together, and the other example is going to be with domino kidneys, all right? So let's look at this case first, which is very interesting. It's not too common, but it does happen. And it has to do with cystic fibrosis, which is an illness of the lungs, and it's degenerative. It's a genetic illness. In fact, it follows Mendelian inheritance. And what happens is that the mucus, thick mucus, begins to accumulate over the years inside the lungs, in the alveoli, and the form, it gets thickened and hardened. And so the person has more and more difficulty breathing, right? And it can be long-term debilitating and maybe even fatal. And so these patients with cystic fibrosis, what they need essentially is a new lung. They need a new lung, especially a lung that doesn't have their own genetics that builds up this mucus, all right? And so that would be a cadaveric donor. However, it turns out that for surgical reasons, it's easier to transplant the whole chest. In other words, lung and hearts together. I want to show you here for a moment just the circulation. Look at human circulation for a moment so you understand that there are fewer connections to cut when we transplant the whole chest, meaning hearts and lungs together, because we have kind of a double circulation. All right, let's look at this diagram, for example. And here you notice that we have a systemic circulation and we have a pulmonary circulation. Let me make this a little bigger. Give me a minute here. It doesn't get bigger, actually. You could pause the recording for a moment so I get this diagram up and running. Okay, this is what I'm talking about with regards to the double circulation that we have. We have what is known as a pulmonary circulation or pulmonary circuit going from the heart to the lungs and back to the heart. And then we have a systemic circulation, or the systemic circuit, going from the heart to the rest of the body and back to the heart again. Okay, so let's look at that circulation because it switches from oxygen-rich blood to oxygen-poor blood, and it's reversed, whether we're talking about the pulmonary circulation or the systemic circulation. First of all, just to keep in mind, to distinguish between arteries and veins, an easy way to remember is that arteries go out of the heart. Arteries go out of the heart, and veins go into the heart. Veins go into the heart. So when you consider the letter artery written in capital letters, uppercase, the A looks like an arrow. The capital A looks a little bit like an arrow. So the arrow goes out, right? The arrow goes out of the heart. Those are arteries. Whereas the vein is a V shape and it goes in. It's like a wedge that goes in. So veins go into the heart. And that's just a little mnemonic, easy way to remember that. Whether they're carrying oxygen-rich blood or oxygen-poor blood, it's a different story, okay? Because like I say, it's going to flip between the pulmonary circulation and the systemic circulation. So let's look at the systemic circulation first. Systemic meaning for the whole system of the body, all of the organ systems of the body. In other words, this is the body circulation, right? So going out of the heart, we go out through the aorta. And so the aorta is an artery because it's going out of the heart and it's carrying oxygen-rich blood, right? Oxygen-rich blood that goes to all of the organs and tissues of our body. And then through the capillaries, which are single cell thick, all right? The capillaries are so thin, they're microscopic, and what goes through a capillary is one RBC at a time. And the RBC, the red blood cell, is the one that carries the oxygen in the heme group, right? Trapped in the 4 myoglobin proteins. Anyway, arterial blood or coming out of the heart into the systemic circulation is oxygen-rich blood, oxygen-rich, and that's why it's illustrated in red, right? Then the gas exchange occurs in every organ and tissue of our body because of metabolism. In the organs and tissues absorb the oxygen and release CO2, right? Release CO2 into the blood. So now the blood that is leaving organs and tissues and coming back to the heart, that is the venous circulation, and it's oxygen-poor blood, oxygen poor and rich in CO2, and it's illustrated as blue. It's not that it's actually blue, of course, it's just a different shade of red because the RBCs are not oxidized, right? Which is what makes them red. So anyway, that oxygen poor blood, venous blood, is coming back into the heart through veins, and the main veins are the vena cava. The vena cava, the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, they all empty into the heart. Also the heart, sometimes you hear functionally two hearts. We have the left heart and the right heart because they involve different circulation. Okay, so this is all, it comes back into the right heart. So again, the systemic circulation begins on the left atrium, the left heart going into, left ventricle, going into the aorta to the body and irrigating all of the organs and tissues of the body, and then coming back through the vena cava back into the right atrium, which then passes to the ventricle, and the right ventricle then pushes that oxygen poor blood and CO2 rich blood out through an artery, right? Because this artery is leaving the heart, but this is now the pulmonary circulation. So the pulmonary artery takes that blood to the lungs. And you notice here we have an artery that has oxygen poor blood, okay? So the fact that it's an artery is not because it has oxygen rich or oxygen poor blood, it's because it's leaving the heart. It's an artery that is leaving the heart, is going out of the heart, and is going to the lungs. So that's the pulmonary circulation. And at the level of the lungs, at the alveoli, we know that the gas exchange happens again, but in reverse. In other words, the CO2 is dumped out, released, and oxygen is picked up at the alveoli. And so now we have oxygen-rich blood coming back into circulation through the pulmonary veins. So the pulmonary veins carry oxygen-rich blood, but they're coming back into the heart through the left atrium into the left heart to go eventually to the left ventricle and then being pushed out by the heart beat through the aorta, okay? So bottom line, we have two types of circulation. We have the systemic circulation and we have the pulmonary circulation, or circuits. So you see that it is easier to transplant the whole chest from a cadaver than just to transplant the heart or to transplant the lungs, particularly when the patient is in need of lungs, all right? Because it's easier just to cut the vena cava and the aorta and leave the heart-lung circulation or the heart-lung circuit intact. That way we don't have to cut the pulmonary arteries and veins and reconnect that, you see? And so it's easier just to connect the aorta and the vena cava onto the patient, on the cystic fibrosis patient, and that way they get a new lung, but they also get a new heart. In other words, if the match is a match, then it's a match for all of the organs and tissues of the donor and the recipient, you see? And therefore, going back to the CF patient, what they need is new lungs, but like I mentioned, it's easier to take out the entire chest of the CF patient and to put in a new chest, right? And that way the pulmonary circulation remains intact. So what happens? When that procedure is done, it turns out that the lungs of the CF patient, of course, those lungs are no good because they're full of this thickened mucus. So those are discarded as medical waste. Essentially, they're incinerated, and that's the end of that. But the CF patient's heart, the heart is intact, you see, because cystic fibrosis does not affect the heart. And so that heart is intact. In principle, it's a good, healthy heart, which is also being excised with the lungs, right, of the CF patient. And therefore, the idea is that this heart can be transplanted into a heart patient, see? That is waiting for a heart because this patient now is on a very poor heart circulation, is degenerate heart. I think I mentioned to you, I had a friend, he's alive and well, thanks be to God, receive a heart transplant. We're about the same age, him and the wife, they're from, he's from Colombia and she's from Mexico. And anyway, they're good friends of mine for many years. They live down in Homestead. And he was waiting for a transplant for 10 years. He was on the heart transplant list for 10 years, okay? And his heart was down to a 4% efficiency. It was very, very debilitating. He basically did nothing all day long, just waited for the phone call day and night from the transplant center to see if a heart would come in, all right? Typically from a cadaver, obviously, a person who had suffered typically it's a traumatic blow to the head, like I mentioned. Anyway, he got a new heart, and it's been about 3 years now that he's on his new heart and doing fine. He's my age, we're both in the 60s, and he got the heart of a 19-year-old, right? Very young fellow. So in principle, it's a very healthy heart. So, but it was not the case of cystic fibrosis. His was cadaveric. Anyway, what I want to say is that someone who is on the waiting list for a heart transplant could potentially receive a living heart coming from a cystic fibrosis patient, all right? All right. Another type of transplant that is actually more common, the domino transplant, is with domino kidneys. And this one is more common. And the whole issue here is to trying to find a match between donor and recipient. all right? Now, the typical case for donor kidneys is what is known as paired donation or pair matching, which has, let me see, should reverse these slides here. This is the simplest case of a pair exchange, which is 4 people, 2 pairs, 2 donors and 2 recipients. Think about this. So we have the case of a donor and a recipient. Like I say, this would be, it would be, for example, for a living kidney donation, all right? So here we have pair A and pair B. Think about this, pair A and pair B. And pair A is a patient who is on renal failure. They're on renal failure and they're on dialysis, for example. And they have a donor who is willing to donate a kidney, typically a member of the family, either a sibling or parents. Sometimes adult children can also do that. That's generally the closest match, right, within the family, within the nuclear family. If not, maybe extended family, or just another person, a friend or anonymous. The point is that we have, for this pair A, we have the patient who is on kidney failure, on dialysis, waiting for a transplant, and the donor who's willing to donate a kidney, right? But they're not a match. They're not a match. They're incompatible. Then we have pair B, which is the same, but it's another pair. In other words, we have another person who is on renal failure and dialysis and is waiting for a transplant. And this other person, this other patient also has come across a donor. Again, it could be a member of the family or someone else, but now they also have a donor for kidney, for living kidney. But they're not a match either. So pair B is not a match either. But it turns out that donor A is a match with recipient B, with patient B. And donor B is a match for patient A, you see? So it's a cross match. And of course, this is nationwide. And that's why it's important to look at these 2 agencies that are looking at the procurement and the allocation of organs and tissues throughout the whole nation, because a match could be found on another pair that is living somewhere else in the United States. But all that takes basically is a plane ride to put those 4 people together in the same hospital, right? And so that is called a pair exchange. And it's the simplest case of domino kidneys. And typically the 4 surgeries are done simultaneously. They're done even in, so not all hospitals are transplant hospitals. Typically large municipal hospitals are transplant hospital. For example, here, Jackson Memorial is a transplant hospital in Dade County. And what they have is they have the surgical theaters that are next to each other so that they literally physically minimize the transport time between the donor and the recipient, all right? And so for this type of pair exchange, what is needed is literally 4 surgical theaters to be adjacent to each other so that the 4 surgeries are going on simultaneously. The 2 recipients are being opened up to receive the transplant, to receive the kidneys, and the 2 donors are also being opened up and their kidneys are excised to make the exchange, all right? And remember, it's gonna be a cross exchange. Donor A is a match with recipient B, and donor B is a match with recipient A. And that's another reason why the 4 surgeries are done simultaneously so that nobody backs up. There's no sequence, right? Because let's say that donor A donates to recipient B. Now recipient B already has their kidney and they're good to go. And so donor B could then say, okay, well, my friend or my family member has his or her kidney already, so I'm going to back out and not donate my kidney because my person of interest already has the kidney, right? And they would back out. All this is done on a voluntary basis, of course. So then that leaves recipient A, patient A, without a kidney and without a donor. And so that would be bad news for that patient A, correct? And therefore, once everybody agrees and consents and signs all the necessary forms, the 4 surgeries typically are done simultaneously, right? Okay, so other things that are important is that typically these are kept anonymous. Of course, the donors and recipients of each pair know who their donors are, but they don't know who the donor is on the other side, okay, for the other pair. So that's kept anonymous to try to maintain everything above board, and so that there's no organ trafficking here or pay of money or any other in-kind gift, right, or payment for the organ or the tissue that is being received. So all of these donations are voluntary, and there's no exchange of money going on. Otherwise, if that is happening, then we're getting into the dark web and organ trafficking and human trafficking and all that, which I'll cover later a little bit more. But here we are on everything that is legal and ethical and proper to be done. I also want to mention that there was a case, at least one that I know of, that happened back in 2012, just to prove how far this pair exchange can be taken with a real domino effect. You know, the domino comes from putting the domino chips one next to the other upright, and then you collapse one and they all go down in a row sequentially, one after the other, right? And this was an exchange that was done, a domino kidney exchange that was done between 60 people, 30 donors and 30 recipients, okay? And it was done throughout the whole nation. This was in the United States. It was done back about 8 years ago. And so this is just the beginning of the news report here. Very interesting. It took about 4 months to do the whole thing, and dozens of hospitals throughout the US. Okay, people flying, donors and recipients flying here and there. And it was all organized beforehand, of course, down to the T of every detail needed. So I start with this fellow Rick Rusamenti, who was in a yoga class with someone else and was talking with someone else who told them about a kidney, that their friend needed a kidney. And so he decided, this fellow Rick decided to donate his kidney. Why not? He donated his kidney. It was to a stranger. It was anonymous. And so it's what we call an altruistic donation. Altruistic, okay, altruism. And he agreed to donate his kidney to this stranger, to this other person, to start the domino effect, all right? To start the chain. So he was like donor A, if you will, or donor 1. So he's donating to recipient 2, all right? And then it's moved along down the way. And eventually the last one would be the one who matches with the recipient 1. 30 pairs of surgeries later. So anyway, the long, the short is that all this was put together beforehand and then executed like clockwork. Like I said, involved 30 living donors of kidneys and 30 recipients, 30 patients who are on renal failure. And the last one was this fellow Don Terry, was the last one to receive his kidney. So imagine his angst, right? He was waiting for the whole chain to take place because he was the last one. He was a diabetic fellow, and he lived in Chicago at the time. So it was the Loyola University Medical School, Medical Center, Medical Hospital that did the transplantation of the last one. Okay, and it took about 4 months to do every one, but it was done and it was successful. And so this is the one on record, as far as I know. Look at that, 17 hospitals involved, 11 states throughout the US. Very interesting, very exciting, very creative. Here's the website that you can go to read the full article. It gives you more details and all the trials and travails that they had to go through, and some iffy moments there, because of course the big question here is, what if one of the donors backs out, right? That could break the chain. Could it break the chain if one of the donor backs away or drops off from the sequence? And it almost happened, because it turns out, I forget which donor it was, but when I read the full article, I remember at one point, I don't know if it was somewhere midpoint or where, which donor, but this donor was having second thoughts and was thinking of backing out. All right, and that would have broken the chain. So would that be totally, thanks be to God that that donor who was thinking of backing out was convinced by a number of people to continue and to go forward, that it would be okay and everything else, that he or she, I forget if it was a man or a woman, would be okay after the surgery, just some recovery time, and they could have a significant healthy life going forward. So finally, he or she went ahead with the transplant, with the donation, and did not break the chain, okay? But for a moment there, it was very iffy. What would be some recourse that the team would have if, in fact, one of these domino donors walked away? One recourse would be, in a scramble under emergency, again, to go back into the donor list, into the agency of procurement agency that I'll talk about in a minute, and to see last minute if there was a substitute that could walk in, could come in to substitute that, that other donor who had walked away. Very challenging, of course, because they have to have essentially the same match, being that all the surgeries had been scheduled ahead of time, and it was on a schedule, if you will. So they would have to try to find a match, but they would have to rearrange. So we can think hypothetically, if the match was not exactly, let's say that it was donor 16 that backed away for recipient 17, they would have to find a new donor 16 to match recipient 17, or maybe not. Maybe they had to rearrange and do some more scrambling and changing down the chain, because maybe the new donor 16 did not match with recipient 17, but match with recipient 22 or something like that, right? And so it was a real scramble. It would be, but it's still feasible and possible to pull it off, but becomes much, much more difficult, right? All goes back to the pool of donors that there is, the pool of donors. So the broader, the bigger the pool of donors, then the more possibility for success, the greater chance of success of these domino kidneys being able to take place, okay? All right, I mentioned the Cyprus case already. Now, let's look at these two agencies, because I've talked about them already. First of all, we go back to the 1980s, 84, when transplants were already pretty well established in the medical profession, and there was a high rate of success. And so people who were going on organ failure, and there were people of means that had the money to pay, and we cannot expect everyone in society to have the same value system that we have, all right? So sadly, there are some people with means that are rich and unscrupulous. They don't have the value system that we have, so they would be willing to go in the black market and pay for a kidney or a heart or a liver, whatever it is that they need to keep on living. And then that goes, of course, into organ traffic and human traffic, where they take literally people from other countries of the world and take out the organs, okay? It's dark, it's macabre, it's occurring, and it's very sad. It's a multi-million-dollar industry what circulates there. because it's, again, it's supply and demand, right? Some people unscrupulously are willing to pay whatever, and so they're going to find someone who will do it. And this occurs, is happening, unfortunately, is part of the contemporary scenario of organ trafficking and human trafficking. And what they have available to them, these people today, is the dark web. In other words, that there are technological means of doing stuff like this that was not available back a few years or a few decades ago. And therefore, it's the whole issue of what can be done, right? Remember the technological imperative. What can be done will be done sooner or later, regardless of whether it's ethical or not. And that's why it's very important to do bioethics, right? Because in bioethics, not everything that can be done should be done. Remember, I looked at what may be done out of what can be done in science and technology today. So obviously not everything that can be done should be done. We need to consider the ethical, moral implications of what's going on. Okay, so because of all that, there was an act of Congress back in 1984 that is called the National Organ Transplant Act. All right, so this is by legislation at the federal level, at the national level. And the acronym is NOTA for short, NOTA, N-O-T-A, which again stands for National Organ Transplant Act. It's an act of Congress, it's a law that defines how to procure organs and how to allocate organs in the United States, okay? And the fact that receiving or moving organs across international borders is illegal and so forth. So this is done by regulation by these two networks that are themselves overseen or regulated by government agencies that make sure that everything is going on that is legal and ethical, and that there's no money going across the table on this, okay? So there are actually two agencies that are distinct from each other. They have their own function, but they are in constant communication. So again, that there is no conflict of interest between receiving the organ and allocating the organ. So the agency that receives the organ is the Organ Procurement Transplantation Network, OPTN for short. So this is the acronym, OPTN, which again stands for Organ Procurement Transplantation Network. And this is the one that receives the organ, but I put receive in quotations because it's actually a registry. In other words, all this is done virtually. It's not that OPTN has a building full of freezers and boxes where the organs are being kept, all right? Not at all. This is a computer bank. It's a computer system where they have the information, precisely the PRA scores and the matching scores of thousands and hundreds of thousands of patients who are on the transplant list, waiting for organs or tissues. And so this OPTN is essentially a computer bank where they have all of the information, the biological, the physiological information, and the personal information of all the people who are, all the patients who are on transplant lists. Okay, and the biggest one of those is the kidneys. And I understand it's close to 100,000 kidney people are on the transplant list or dialysis waiting for a kidney donation, all right? In the United States, about 100,000 right now. That's the biggest one by far. And so again, this is a registry for organs, and also the donors, people who are willing to donate, their information goes into this bank here, into this network of OPTN. For example, either people who put it on their license or people who die and have already stated beforehand that they want to donate, or if they did not make a statement, but the next of kin or the proxy, the surrogate, whoever is now in charge of that cadaver, to make decisions, they can also go ahead and decide to donate the organs of their dead loved one. Okay, and so right away the matching scores are done and sent into OPTN so that it's there waiting to find a match. Then there is the other network that is known, is called United Network for Organ Sharing. United Network for Organ Sharing. The acronym is UNOS for short, okay? And this is the one that actually allocates the organs. So these two data banks are in communication with each other 24/7 all the time, because again, we understand that people are going on organ failure all the time throughout the United States at different parts of the country. And people are also going on the donor list, either living or cadaveric if they died with the intention of donating. That's happening all the time throughout the United States too. And so these two systems are in constant communication with each other. It's a very dynamic interactive system looking for matches all the time. Also, keep in mind that we have at least 3 time zones throughout the United States. So people are in this system in and out all the time. That's what is referred to as the transplant list for whatever organ or tissue it is. Of course, the set of criteria is very, very specific for each organ, for the allocation, for the harvesting of the organ, and for the allocation. There are specific requirements and criteria that are looked at to see if the organs or the tissues are healthy enough to be transplanted, etc. Now, there's another aspect in the United States that is known as target donation. Target donation. And with target donation, this is what happens. When a donor finds, when a recipient finds a donor who is willing to donate, we're talking specifically about living organ or tissue donation, all right? But more specifically about living organs, and even more specific than that, typically the typical organ is the kidney, again, because one can donate a kidney and keep on living a normal life. On average, in principle, people are healthy. And therefore, if a person on kidney failure, on dialysis, finds a donor that is willing to give them their kidney, that's called a target donation. And that bypasses the waiting list. It bypasses the 100,000 who are on the waiting list, okay? And so it's direct and it's targeted. It's voluntary and it's altruistic and there's no money involved or any other gift in kind, right? So I know at least in the United States, which is the case that I'm more familiar with, it does bypass the waiting list. In Europe, for example, I understand that they do have target donation, but it doesn't bypass the waiting list. Okay, so it means that if a person on renal failure in Europe finds a donor, that's great, but that donor needs to donate to someone on the list that has a higher priority than their family or friend who is in need of a kidney. It still helps because it moves the list along, it moves the list forward, right? And their family or friend who is in need of a kidney will advance 1 notch in principle on the list, but it doesn't go directly to the family or the friend, okay? So it doesn't bypass the waiting list, it just moves it along. That's because they have a different concept also with regards to medicine. Also, they have the socialized medicine, more or less throughout Europe, different models of it and so forth. But it's just different. Here in the States, it's more on an individual basis. And so it's more kind of a market economy, if you will, in the sense that, or analogous to that, that if the recipient was able to find a donor, then they go forward and it does bypass the list. Okay. What else do we have? Okay, so at this point, I want to talk about, just give a little testimony because it makes it personal for me, and that's why I'm able to give this lecture in the healthcare course. because it turns out that, let me say, about 13 years ago, I actually donated a kidney. All right, so I donated a kidney to a parishioner. I was at St. Kevin Parish at that time. I was pastor in a parish out in West Kendall, and this was in the 90s, the second half of the 90s. And I met a family, and it was one lady who had a complicated medical history, and we've become friends, and we're friends now for many years. It turns out that she had a complicated medical history. I knew her and the parents and the child. She had a little kid at that time. But she had a stroke about 30 years ago and had become hemiplegic, in other words, paralyzed on the right side of her body. And she used to be right-handed also, which means that she had to learn how to write again as an adult with her left hand, and also even learn how to speak again and everything, because it was pretty traumatic aneurysm, a stroke that she had. And therefore, she lost her kidneys. She lost both the kidneys. She went on renal failure of both the kidneys and the pancreas. And over the years, she had one transplant already, which was cadaveric. And that first transplant was a double transplant, one of the first double transplants that was done here in Jackson, as far as I know. That was kidney and pancreas at the same time. So that kidney lasted about 12 or 15 years, more or less. And then, no, less than that. It was cadaveric kidney, maybe 8 or 10 years, something like that. But eventually, she went on renal failure after that first transplant. The pancreas, by the way, is still functioning, very low now. It's been over 30 years, but she's now she's diabetic, and so she's on insulin, but the pancreas is still producing a little bit. It's still there, that original pancreas that was transplanted. At any rate, when she went on renal failure after the first transplant, she eventually qualified for a second transplant, which is also cadaveric. But the second one didn't last that long. It lasted maybe 3 or 4 years, something like that. And then she went on renal failure again. At that point, her life history had become more complicated. Sadly, her husband walked away, and she was still raising the little kid. And then the parents were getting old. Her father had died, and she's an only child, no siblings. So essentially, she was taking care of her mother, who was becoming more elderly. So she had a lot of hardship in her life, having to take care of a little kid and her aging mother, and being on renal failure, having to go to dialysis 3 times a week for 3 to 4 hours, having a shunt on her arm, and having the stroke and everything else. So it was a very difficult, complicated medical history, and therefore a very harsh life. So I had known from my biology background and from actually teaching it theoretically that one could donate a kidney and keep on living. So without telling her anything, right, I considered the possibility of donating a kidney and check it out and see, if it would be possible. So the first thing that I did actually was I contacted the Jackson Center, the transplant center at Jackson Memorial Hospital. At this time, I'm living already in Philadelphia because, let me see, I left St. Kevin in the year 2000. That's when I was sent for further studies the second time around over at Purdue. I was there for 4 years to 2004. And then in 2005, I was assigned to the National Catholic Bioethics Center. I know that some of you have heard of this center. It's like the word says, like the phrase says, it's a Catholic center that does bioethic analysis at the national level. All right, so we do consultation, a lot of consultation for individuals, but also for institutions, typically Catholic hospitals, but other healthcare systems that want us to do an analysis, a professional analysis on some kind of bioethical issue, typically beginning of life or end of life or cooperation with evil and so forth, merger between a Catholic hospital and a non-Catholic hospital, so forth. So this center is in Philadelphia, and I was assigned there for several years after graduating from Purdue, the NCBC. Some of you have heard of it, I know. At any rate, I was there when I was with this issue of her second renal failure came up, and we had stayed in touch with the family and so forth. So I knew that she was on renal failure again. And so what I did was this. I knew that all her profile was at Jackson Transplant Center, because that's where she had the first 2 cadaveric transplants. Okay, so I called the hospital. I called up the transplant center and asked the basic question without letting her know anything first, because no sense. See, if we're not a match, there's no sense getting the hopes up of a donation if we're not a match, right? And then comes a big disillusionment. So I said, let me see if I can do the panel score on my blood and see if we're a match first without saying anything to the recipient. And if we're not a match, then that's the end of the story, because there's no match, period. But if there is, then I would go ahead and tell her that I would be willing to donate her a kidney if she wanted to accept it. So at the transplant center, I was told, yes, we can do that if you like. And what we do is we send you all of the vials, all of the test tubes that we need for blood testing, and then you can send that back by mail. So sure enough, in about a week, more or less, I got a box from the UPS, and it had about a dozen little test tubes, and they were heparinized. In other words, they had heparin inside, which prevents blood clotting, all right? And so it happens that at the parish where I was living, when I was in residence in Philadelphia, Our Lady of Hope was a parish that had a large Filipino community. And I mention this because I find so many aspects of the whole thing that was kind of leading me toward saying this is the right thing to do. This is, the Lord is pleased with this and is giving his approval. And this is what I mean. You know that the Filipino community, Philippines is a very Catholic country. And also there are a lot of nurses that come from the Philippines here in the United States. My understanding is that the nursing schools in the Philippines are accredited by agencies that have certification somehow here in the United States, so that nurses that who come from the Philippines typically can get a job, a nursing job in the United States right away. Okay. Now, also in addition to that, in part because of their Catholic background, quite frankly, but they're also very family oriented. They're family oriented, so it's not uncommon to find in the Philippines extended families where you have 3 or maybe 4 generations living together and caring for each other. So it's a caring community is what I'm trying to say. And that's why they make good nurses, both women and men, okay, also male nurses that come from the Philippines, more women, but also male nurses. Anyway, the point is that the pastor of the parish where I was in Philadelphia, who was also a Filipino priest, he was the chaplain for the Filipino community, the Filipino Catholic community in Philadelphia. And so they would gather at his place, the Filipino community, and they kept a very tight bond and very friendly. They would do parties every now and then and invite me and so forth. Anyway, there were quite a few Filipino nurses there, is my point. And so I was talking to one of the nurses. I said, look, I'm trying to do this project of donating a kidney, but I need to have all these vials, the blood. Basically, I need someone to draw the blood into these vials, and then we'll send it back to the transplant center in Miami. And she said, sure, Father, no problem. I'll bring my equipment one Sunday afternoon after Mass, and we'll just say, well, we can sit there in the rectory and clean up the place. And then if you don't mind drawing blood for these 12 vials, and then I'll send it back. And I said, fine, we'll do it. And so we did that. Okay, one Sunday afternoon after Mass, we just went to the rectory, and she drew all the vials or the blood necessary. And then I put it back in the box and sent it by return mail to Jackson. Would you know it, then in about 2 weeks after that, I get a call and they say, sir, you're a match, okay? You're not a perfect match, and that's why I know about the scale. I remember it was like around 2.5 or 3. They said, you're not a perfect match, but you're a match that is good enough so that if you want to proceed, you may go ahead and contact this lady and tell her that you're willing to donate, see what happens. So then, fine, I did that. And at first he said, no, I cannot have a kidney from a priest. I cannot endanger your life and all this. I said, look, put it in prayer and let's see what happens. Okay, I'm willing to donate. I know from the scientific side that it can be done. And of course, there are living donors around and they live a perfectly normal life. Okay, so put it in prayer, and I'll put it in prayer too, and let's see what happens. It turns out we're both devoted to St. Benedict, and it had been on the day of St. Benedict that the result had come back that we're a match. So I said, why don't you take some time to put this in prayer and ask St. Benedict if he wants to inspire you to take this donation and move forward. So after some time that she did put her in prayer, says, okay, well, fine, let's do this. I'm very honored by the thing and everything else. So we arranged it. Then actually, that's where the process actually began or continue forward, because then it wasn't just as easy as wanting to be an owner and having the match. The donor also has to be certified. In other words, the donor has to receive clearance from a number of medical doctors, okay? At least 3 that I remember. One was my general practitioner, my own doctor, who happens to be also a practicing Catholic. I married them many years ago. He's been following me all of my priestly life because I met him when I started, when I was ordained back 35 years ago. So he has a long medical history on me. And I talked to him about it. And first he said, well, you're crazy to do this, but you're healthy physically, physiologically. I can certify you because you're healthy to donate. So if you really want to do it, you have my clearance on that. Then the other one was a nephrologist. I had to get certified by a nephrologist to see if the kidneys actually qualify. Okay. And so I did that in Philadelphia because that's where I was living at that time. Just scheduled a meeting with a nephrologist there, and that went through also. He gave the clearance. And then finally, when I came to Miami, I had to get certified also by a psychiatrist from Jackson, all right, from the transplant center directly. And the psychiatrist wants to look at a different angle of things. And his basic question was this: what if you go through with the donation? Now you've given 1 kidney, so you only have 1 kidney left. It's called solitary kidney. And now you know that anything can happen to that 1 kidney, right? And that's the only one you have left. So and what if after donating, the patient a few days after, or a week after, or a month, and your kidney goes bad on her, and it's a failure, and she's back on renal failure, and she's back on dialysis, and your donation was wasted? What happens then? You know, and he's looking for some kind of reaction. I go, oh no, what did I do? This is crazy. Now I'm without a kidney and it's a failure. This is horrible. So he was measuring to see what kind of reaction I would have. Well, again, thanks be to God about the faith and everything else. And I think that the scientific background also helped, frankly, to put it in context and say, well, doctor, look, I was willing to give it my best, you know. And so if it didn't work, it didn't work. I'm a man of God and I believe in divine providence. So if it didn't work, well, for some reason, God didn't want it to work, and that's it. But at least we gave it a try. You know, and I still have my one kidney, and I plan to take care of it and drink plenty of water and all that, and stay healthy the rest of my life for as long as the good Lord wants me to be here. And so that's, well, okay, you're crazy enough to do this, so go ahead. And he gave me the certification also, but they needed that clearance from the doctors. Okay. Then they also do a scan of the kidneys to see which one qualifies. And I found this interesting. I was really kind of having a lot of fun going through the whole process and looking at it from the clinical perspective to see how the level of detail that there was in the whole process. Obviously, I'm talking from the donor perspective because before the operation, I was the one that was more active in all the clinical stuff, and the recipient was just basically waiting there until the day of the surgery itself. Okay. Of course, going through dialysis all the while, one day on, one day off. Now, the scan was interesting because they need to determine which is the best kidney to qualify. All right, which is the best kidney. Give me a minute here for a moment. Just need to take a little pause. Okay, so I was talking about the scan of the kidneys to determine which kidney qualifies better for the donation. And it makes a difference if it's the right or the left kidney. All right, because first of all, you know that the kidneys are pretty high up on the back. They're actually up into the thoracic region there, the bottom of the ribs. So they're pretty high up on the chest, on the core of the body, to the point that the liver is in front of the right kidney. All right, so it's not as accessible. But the left kidney, it's mostly the stomach, but the stomach is much easier to move the stomach aside. And so the left kidney is more accessible, especially for robotic surgery. So if it's going to be done robotically, okay, then, or laparoscopically, they call it laparoscopically, then the left kidney, if the left kidney qualifies, the operation can be done laparoscopically. And that means that the incisions are much smaller and it's an easier, more effective operation to do it laparoscopically. The robot is called a Da Vinci robot, and it actually has all these arms coming out, or tubes, 6 or 8 tubes, and each tube moves more like the tentacles of an octopus. Each tube has a different function, but they basically, and so the good news is that my left kidney is the one that qualified better than the right kidney, so they can do it laparoscopically. To the point that my operation was only about 3.5 hours or so, maybe 3.5 to 4 hours. Her operation was about a dozen, it was 12 hours. So she was under surgery for 12 hours. And part of that, it was so long for her, is because, so her operation was obviously traditional, open her from side to side, right, on the abdominal region. And the bulk of that time was very painstakingly removing the scar tissue that had developed from the 2 previous cadaveric transplants, okay? And so, first of all, on the side of the recipient, on the patient, the original kidneys that had atrophied and become smaller and so forth are left in place. They're left in place. So they're not excised, taken out or anything. They're just left in place. And then the new kidneys are attached much closer to the bladder in the abdominal region, okay, much closer to the bladder, because they have to connect the ureter, which is that little tube that goes from the kidney to the bladder, okay? And so the new kidneys are put just in the abdominal region toward the front area. And so those 2 other kidneys had to be removed, and there was a lot of scar tissue that had developed over the years around those two kidneys, and that had to be cut painstakingly by hand, from the surgeon and so forth, very slowly. And but on my side, on the donor side, because it was done laparoscopically, it just involves 3 incisions around the abdominal region, small incisions, less than an inch, maybe half an inch long or so. And then they put the 3 little tubes in through there. And each tube has different instrumentation. Like, for example, one tube is a light and a lens at the same time, and a camera to see inside. Another tube is essentially a pump or a vacuum. And the third tube is instruments, but the instruments are very different. They're not traditional instruments of a scalpel, for example, that we used to, or little scissors or blades. It's an ultrasound system, okay, that cuts and cauterizes at the same time. So at the front end, it's cutting, it's making the incision actually through tissue, through capillaries. And the back end of that same little instrument is sealing, is cauterizing the capillaries. So there's minimal blood flow, all right, or blood that seeps out into the region. So it's very, very sophisticated type of surgery that is done, and much more precise. Also, the lens, for example, magnifies the abdominal region 2 to 4 times bigger, and it's projected on a screen. So the surgeon, the doctor, has a lot of equipment that is used that is very, very sophisticated to do this kind of surgery. Oh, the other tube that is a pump or a vacuum, first what they do is they pump CO2 into the abdominal region, and they generate like a dome in the abdominal region. They blow you up with CO2, all right, gas, and that CO2 is there to generate like a dome so that the machines can work in there, all right? And so they do that, and they cut around and so forth, and cauterize all the arteries and veins. And then the last incision that they do is actually around the navel. They do like a half moon incision around the navel that is just long enough for the hand of the surgeon to fit inside my stomach, not the stomach, but the abdominal region, to literally pull out the kidney that now has been disconnected from all the plumbing, all right? And they also take out a good section of the ureter to use for connecting into the recipient's bladder. But basically, it's just the size of the surgeon. And I remember another detail. Imagine how fine-tuned the transplantation team is done. I remember the surgeon who was working on me is a woman, Dr. Chan, and she is Chinese Jamaican. Now, the point about this is that since she has a Chinese ancestry, she's small, she's petite, and her hands are very small, okay? And so they put the surgeon with the small hands on the donor, so that incision is the least size incision possible, just for her hand to fit inside my abdominal region to literally pull out that kidney, all right? So that's the level of sophistication, Dr. Chan. She's petite and has little hands. And so it actually was 3 surgeons that were involved in the process actively. There may have been other surgeons observing on the background, but at least 3 that I know of, all right, was Dr. Chan, Dr. Chancho, who's Italian, and then Dr. Burke was on the recipient. And the surgeries were going on, like I say, simultaneously. And so Dr. Burke was working on the recipient. And then Dr. Chancho just literally walked the kidney from one surgical theater to the other one. All right. I guess it was a small walk there, but he's the one who transplanted literally the kidney from one patient to the other. Mm-hmm. So these 3 surgeons were involved. They're part of the team, of the kidney transplant team at Jackson. So Then the recovery was, I was in the hospital 3 days. They get you up by the next day. They get you up on your feet and have you take a few steps and so forth. But it's very proactive. By the second day, I was walking the hallways already very slowly with my IV and the Christmas tree, you know, the IV hanging on the pole and everything. By the third day, they kicked me out of the hospital, and then she was released 1 or 2 days after that, because her surgery was much more involved than mine, of course. At any rate, I was convalescing for about 1 to 2 weeks, more or less, and the pain was diminishing, all right? But at first, I had 2 types of pain. One was abdominal pain, and the other one was a pain in my upper back around the shoulder blade back there. And so it turns out that the pain on the abdominal, it was not pain from the incisions, but rather the abdominal pain was because of the gas. In other words, that CO2, they take out with the tube, the vacuum tube, they take out as much CO2 as possible, but they have to be very careful because they don't want to suck out any tissue either or cause a hemorrhage inside, right? And so they have to leave some CO2 inside to pass passively. They just have to pass through the walls of the stomach to of the intestines, yes, into the intestinal system and then back out the backside. And so that took several days for that gas to pass passively, all right? And that was a discomfort that I had on the stomach, just like when one has gas issues, all right? That kind of pain was there. And it kept diminishing slowly, little by little. The other pain on the back, I couldn't figure out until later. I looked it up online, and it turns out that typically they put the patient in a prone position where they tie, so they tie one hand, they put my hand and my foot to the back, and then they tie them together. They tie the hand and the foot together, right? And it's a very odd thing to do. Why would the patient be tied like that? You think it's some kind of a torture chamber. It turns out that when patients are unconscious under anesthesia, it has happened that there is some involuntary movement that happens, even if the patient is on general anesthesia. And one of these possible unconscious movement that the body will do is to raise their arm, to move their arm across, let's say, across their belly or across their face, across their head, one arm or the other. And it's an involuntary movement because the patient is obviously under general anesthesia. And you can imagine how disruptive that would be for the surgery that's taking place, either laparoscopically or the other one, traditional surgery. And so the hand is tied to the back like that, right? So that it doesn't go across and create havoc for the surgery that's occurring. And so that pain also took a while. And at first I couldn't figure out what it was. Why did I get damaged or injured back there? And then it turns out that it was, you know, it was a muscle pain for being in that position for about 3 or 4 hours, having my arm behind my back 3 to 4 hours. Like when we have a bad position, when we sleep in a bad position, and then we get like a neck pain, something similar to that. Anyway, that was the extent of it. So really for about 2 weeks of discomfort, right? Of course, with pain medication and everything else, I was able to donate a kidney, save a life, and at the same time, just keep on living, because you can see me here 13 years later. I feel as healthy as I've ever been, and doing lots of plenty activity. You see me at the forest, climbing trees and cutting down the trees, and I go swimming, I go snorkeling. I feel very, very healthy, you know. And so it can happen. I'm just pointing out that it is a success. When we do the numbers and we look at 100,000 people on the waiting list, excuse me for a moment, just a minute, please, let me pause. Sorry for the pause there. I was mentioning that there's approximately 100,000 people in the United States who are on the waiting list for kidney donation, whether it's living or cadaveric. right? And these typically are on dialysis, sometimes for years, waiting for this donation. And so if we look at the numbers, right, we have over 300 million people in the United States. Of course, not everyone is an adult, and adults would be the ones who qualify for being a living kidney donor. But it may be 250 or so adult men and women in the United States that could qualify for donating a kidney. And I remember doing the math one time, it's less than 0.1%. If 0.1% of the American population donated a kidney, we would wipe out that list of 100,000 people waiting for a donation, okay? Just with 0.1%, which is 1/10 of 1% of the American population, of the American adults. And that would wipe out that list. It's just amazing with such little collective effort that we could together be able to accomplish so much good for these people who sometimes for years have been on dialysis, on that rigor that is so debilitating and so heartbreaking. So I say this for everyone to consider, and also that the age for being able to donate keeps extending. I think it's in the 70s. They'll take a donation, a kidney donation from a man or a woman who is healthy up until their 70s. And so that's a great thing to hear. And oh yes, and the other advantage of donating a living kidney, like with any living organ, is that typically the duration of the organ is about twice as long on the recipient. Okay, on the recipient, on the person on renal failure receives a kidney will last twice as long as a cadaveric. So on average, about 15 years that kidney can last on the recipient. So there are many advantages to that. Again, the operation for the donor is totally free, and for the recipient, typically with the insurance that they have, will be covered. But for the donor, I know from experience that it's totally free, and that's it. And then there's a follow-up also for 1 year. The recipient, of course, is followed medically for a lifetime, but for the donor, there's at least when I did it back 13 years ago, it was a 1 year follow-up monthly visit to the Jackson Center to make sure that everything was fine. And again, 13 years later, I can tell you that everything is fine. Okay, what else? So just getting to the final slide here. There are a number of bioethical issues that come up in organ transplantation. We've covered most of them already, but from previous lectures also, or even previous courses, we've talked about the determination of death, that typically accepting the neurological criterion of brain death, as long as it is total brain death meaning including the brain stem, then we accept that as valid. Excuse me a moment. Yes, I was saying that the neurological criterion for the determination of death, as long as it is total brain death, including the brain stem, then we accept it as valid. And that's typically the declaration of death that is used in many instances for organ donation. The other one, of course, is consent, that the patient needs to, the donor, obviously the patient consents because they're waiting for a transplant, but for the donor, on the donor side, that the donor give their consent, obviously, and that could be, it has to be informed consent while the donor is still living, or if it's cadaveric, then it can be done by proxy. In other words, the surrogate or the representative of the deceased person can also consent on their behalf. There should be no payment for these organs. In other words, it's known as altruistic donation, right? Altruistic, that there is no payment, either or money or anything else in kind, gifts of any sort, so that it doesn't have even the slightest perception of trafficking with these organs, of organ transplant, trafficking. And that leads me to the next item here on the bullet list, which is transplantation tourism. Sadly, there is a dark aspect of transplants, and that's why it is a bioethical issue. We see it periodically coming up on the news here and there. And the typical thing is that there is, excuse me. Apologies again for the interruption. So talking about transplantation tourism, it falls within the whole issue of organ trafficking and human trafficking, which is very, very sad and horrible. And yet it is a multi-million-dollar thing that is occurring. And some people, again, without the scruples that we have, are willing to pay all kinds of money to procure organs and tissues throughout the world. And one of them is known as transplantation tourism, where these people with means and a need for a vital organ will transport the entire team of surgeons and nurses and anesthesiologists and everyone that is needed onto a hotel in a foreign country. This had been known to happen in China, for example. And they would transplant the entire team over there, into a hotel and set up the hotel room essentially as a surgical suite for doing the transplant. And then they will procure the organ somewhere in a developing country, either by paying for the organ if it's a living organ like a kidney, or actually kidnapping people and sequestering their organs, their vital organs. Okay, this sadly is happening, and it's part of this horrible traffic of organs and human traffic that is occurring today. The technology has allowed it because with this sophisticated technology that is there, particularly the dark web, they can do these deals, all right? But it's obviously highly unethical and illegal, to say the least. And so ties in with organ trafficking also. I mentioned that sometimes they go into developing countries like Latin America or Africa or Asia to procure organs, and they'll pay the people hundreds of dollars, maybe several $100s for their kidney, knowing that people can donate a kidney and continue living. And so several $100s represents in these places maybe a whole year's wage or more. And then they'll, of course, get hundreds of thousands of dollars for that organ, typically for the kidney, elsewhere in the world. Okay, so this is all part of this organ trafficking, and that's why there should be no payment for organs when it's done here in the States or anywhere else. It should be totally altruistic donation. Okay, beyond that, the last point that I want to talk about is this opt-in or opt-out, which are two systems. Currently, the system certainly in the United States and in many parts of the world, when it's done legally and ethically, all right, it's an opt-in. In other words, people opt in to be donors, whether it's going to be in their lifetime or if it's going to be at their death, they opt into donating their organs. But there's another system that's been talked about, which is opt-out. In other words, that the understanding, the default for that particular country would be that when a person dies, their organs are harvested unless that person opted out of donating their organs. So the assumption socially, at the social level, the assumption is that people upon their death would donate their organs. In other words, they would not take their organs to the grave with them and essentially waste them, but rather they feel fine in donating their organs once they're dead, of course, and therefore that would be an opt-out system. Okay, and I understand that it does occur in a number of countries of the world, particularly in some places in Europe. I think in Austria, perhaps, and some other countries are thinking about it, maybe Belgium, Holland. And of course, for this to happen, is very unlikely that this would happen here in the United States, but you can see that if it does, or even in where the countries where it is happening, there would be an abundance of vital organs available for transplantation, which would certainly reduce drastically the list of patients on the waiting list. Okay, because there would be so many organs available from people who died that essentially it would wipe out those lists in those countries or reduce them drastically. Still, the match has to be made on all that for sure on the clinical side, but I was just thinking what it would take socially to promote something like this. Okay, certainly it would have to be part of the culture already. In other words, there would have to be, to begin with, a massive campaign, information campaign, an educational campaign of what is involved, essentially, stating the obvious that in the grave, those organs are going to rot away, but also always respecting the possibility that people have the freedom to opt out, all right? So those who essentially want to take their organs to the grave, they're perfectly welcome to do that, no problem, but they need to sign some kind of a form, or typically today would be on a website that is managed by the government or some other agency that has full credibility on society, so that those lists are respected and they're passed on. For example, funeral homes would have to have access to those lists, and hospitals and everything else. Those who are dealing with the dying and the family members would also have to have a common knowledge. So it would be common knowledge that this person is opting out, right? And this would have to be talked about in the schools, at the family level, in different social settings, so that everyone is on board in that particular society, in that particular culture, that particular country, that the expectation is that when people die, their organs will be harvested unless they have opted out. All right, they have opted out and stated very clearly that they don't want to donate their organs, basically. So it's a different mindset. It involves a different kind of culture. And in general, I think it's more of animal where there is this aspect of socialized medicine, because it comes from a heightened social conscience. It's typically countries, you see certain parallels. There are countries that are also more concerned about the environment and so forth. And perhaps it tends to be a more pragmatic or utilitarian mentality, but it doesn't have to be necessarily. I think that this could also be an altruistic society that simply values human life and frankly sees that there's no sense in taking these organs to the grave if they're going to be decomposed and wasted. So why not donate those organs, right, upon the death of the person? Okay, so I don't know. I think maybe I'm kind of idealistic, but I think that this could be in the realm of possibility, ethically speaking, but it would have to be a massive, massive campaign of education and information throughout the entire country in a very capillary way, so that ultimately everybody is on board. I probably have to go through some legislation also, so that it's all the legal ramifications and the legal precautions are in place, right? For example, if there was any suspicion that the person didn't want to donate their organs, even if there was nothing written, but if there was a suspicion or something mentioned by the person that they didn't want to donate their organs, then they would be considered as opted out, something like that. I don't know, but it would have to be worked out in society through a series of protocols, town halls, who knows, eventually that something would be set in place in the laws of the land, that the expectation, the default is that when people die, their organs will be harvested for transplantation. Okay, folks, so that's it. Been going for quite a while, so now I will close the session. And as always, turn it into YouTube and send it to you for your review and your summary. Thank you once again, and many blessings to everybody. Bye-bye now.